Welcome. Welcome to another show brought to you tonight by SPIROPICTURES.com. Tonight our show is Cinematic Surrealism, the surreal movement in film in the early years of cinema and what's going on today. We're fortunate to have in our studio tonight Denver filmmaker and artist Will Forrester. There's a side to film that you probably never saw at the local theater complex. And if you ever watched a movie that was Surreal Cinema and you couldn't quite figure out what was going on, that's going to be explained to you tonight by filmmaker Will Forrester. Okay, I was intrigued when you mentioned cinematic surrealism and how it relates to film. So before we jump into that topic, though, I want you to tell us about yourself, your background, your interests, and what you're currently working on.
Okay, well, I'm a filmmaker and musician, and I studied film at the University of Colorado under professors like Stan Brakhage and Bruce Kaelin, and as well, although he's a bit of a narcissist, so I try not to throw him in on the list.
Am I going to have to cut that out? What if he finds this show? That's okay.
It's all right. He needs to know.
Narcissists are great. Yeah. Okay.
So I studied film there. I studied education at Regis University to get my master's degree, and I'm currently an art teacher. But my true passion, aside from art and teaching, is again film and music. And I'm working on a feature film right now called Blood Trail.
Now that's an animation also, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's a hand-drawn animation, so it's kind of going against the grain of what's popular right now with the 3D animation stuff.
Because a lot of those computer-generated movies, some of them are charming, but some of them start to blend together and all look the same.
Yeah, and I would say to this day and age, I mean, I watched Toy Story 3 the other day, and it almost looks like real people, so it's just a step away from being like actors, and it's kind of like, if you're going to make it look that realistic, why not just make a live action picture instead of doing an actual, because animation is, to me, a really complex medium if it's used correctly.
Mm-hmm. Now, talk a little bit about your band you play around Denver. You're fairly well known.
Yeah, so my band is called Flooded Basement, and I'm actually in a bit of a hiatus with the band currently, but I'm still starting my own project called the Emerson Frakes Project.
Yes.
And so, yeah, I might actually go on a tour this summer, just a self-made tour. It's nothing fancy. I don't have a record label or anything like that, where I start in California and drive up the coast to Portland and stop at coffee shops along the way and play some venues like that.
Oh, that'd be fun.
Mm-hmm.
That'd be fun. You could probably film some of it or film some of the weirdos you run into, because you will be camping out.
Yeah,
I'm sure.
Yeah, I'll be sleeping in my car the majority of the time, actually. But I plan on making a documentary too that shows the trip.
That would be fun.
Yeah,
that would really be fun.
Absolutely.
Now, don't you have a little bit of expertise in sleeping in your car?
I do, yeah, and
don't mention any names.
One of my, let's see, Denver colleagues, if you will, or contemporary filmmakers, with the initials of JD, was going to do a collaborative sleeping in your car film project, and that's actually still probably on the books and might be made at some point.
Yeah. Because you did have to sleep in your car a few times, didn't you?
I did, and I mean, as long as you remember to bring hangers and clothes so you have a little bit of privacy, it's not too bad.
Yeah, nice. In the summer, it gets cold here. In the winter, this is Denver.
Yeah. Exactly, but
Okay, back to cinematic surrealism. Describe for us what that is in film, and before you launch into that, I do want to mention it's hot. The surreal films that I've seen and irrational films are very imaginative, and that's where I think a lot of it crosses over, into sci-fi, where they blend.
Mm-hmm.
But other than that, it is its own genre. So take the floor, if you will, and tell us what that is.
Well, it all derives from the surrealistic art movement, the painting movement, which started in Paris in the early 20s. And at that point in time in Paris, Paris was the artistic capital of the world, kind of like New York was in the 50s. So that's when art was really, really thriving at all levels in Paris. And at the same time, that movement was inspired by the writings of Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, but primarily Freud. So, the major themes within surrealism, whether it be painting or the film movement, are along the lines of there's a political element in almost every surrealistic picture. There's a psychological element, and there's usually a blasphemous element as well.
Okay. One of the films that you had shown me once was by Luis Bunuel.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Oh, well, go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead and tell us about
about
him.
So Luis Bunuel was considered, I suppose, the father of cinematic surrealism. Although Man Ray, the fine artist Man Ray, was making surrealistic films before Bunuel made Chien Andalou in the late 20s. But Luis Bunuel to this day is considered the father and the godfather of surrealism. And a couple of his early pictures, like the film Un Chien Andalou, which was released in the late 20s, was made alongside Salvador Dali. And Salvador Dali actually had a big part in the demise of Luis Bunuel. And part of the reason why Luis Bunuel moved all over the world was because of, or so the story goes, because of something that Salvador Dali had said about him, which was that he was a communist. So for that reason, he wasn't able to work in the United States. He worked in the United States for a short amount of time and then eventually went to Mexico because communism wasn't appreciated at that point in time in the United States.
That's terrible.
Yeah,
That's terrible. So did that happen during the McCarthy witch hunts?
Yeah, it was.
Same time
yeah.
when they chased blacklisted people?
Exactly, in the 50s. And but Bunuel had been making films primarily, he started off in Paris. They had to flee from Spain, which is ironic because of governmental issues, which I think is a major reason why surrealistic pictures are political. Picasso fled from Spain, so Bunuel's from Spain, along with Dali and Picasso. And all of them were in Paris about the same time fleeing from the government in Spain.
Oh, wow.
So it's kind of interesting to think about how...
Now, I've been into Paris, and you've actually lived there. In the area.
Yeah, I lived in Rennes.
Yeah.
Which is in
and it's
northwest
a great
France.
city. It's unique, even today, I think. It's
absolutely.
Such a wonderful place.
It is.
Culturally.
And again, Paris was, that was, its artistic height was in the 20s. And then along came the war and kind of put a halt to all of that. And then after the war, World War II, the United States, I suppose, was more powerful. So with that came the art movement to New York City. So.
Now, did Louis ever live in the United States? I mean, did he go to Hollywood and make movies, or did he do it wherever he was living at the time?
Yeah, he did for a short period of time. I think it was just a few years, and he re-edited, ironically, it was the Hitler documentary made by Leni Riefenstahl. I can't think of.
Was it a propaganda film?
Yeah, it was a propaganda film, and he re-edited that. And actually has a credit re-editing that in the United States.
For Hitler, or re-editing it as an art form?
It was in New York, I think, and he was doing it for the Library of Congress just as an archival thing.
Oh, okay.
But that was the thing, was that he was a genius filmmaker in Paris, had to flee because of the war, and then the stuff with Salvador Dali bad-mouthing him. So he was reduced down at a certain point in his career after he had already made it big to editing films. Basically old documentary films in New York City.
Just to keep the income coming in.
Exactly.
Okay. Was that after he was blacklisted?
Yeah, exactly, yeah. Although, I mean, he was blacklisted from the United States after that. So after that, he went to Mexico.
Okay.
And then from Mexico, he went back to Paris. So his life was circular in terms of him, I suppose, starting in Europe and then dying in Europe and making his beginning films there and his last films there.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. So,
Well, had read, and I don't know if there's any truth to this, that the part of the rift between him and Salvador Dali was over a woman. I think it was Luis Bunuel's wife.
yeah.
Spiro Pictures is a science fiction content provider for the science fiction community. Tonight, we are broadcasting from the Elonian Communication Outpost, planet Earth. The geolocation is 39.7411 north latitude and 104.9842 west longitude.
Every 4 computers now have primary control of critical vehicle functions.
Something like that. It was somebody's wife, and it was over a woman, and it went downhill from there.
Yeah, and a lot of that stuff at this point, it's hard to tell what's fact and fiction.
Yeah.
But it wouldn't surprise me. I mean, what else would it be over?
Yeah.
Drugs.
All right. Now, you were telling me about this first film that was considered one of the first surreal films, and it's a French title, but I'll put it on the website so you can go look for it on DVD. You think these films are out?
Yeah, they definitely are. Yeah, they're readily available.
Okay. Tell us about that one, because that one was very bizarre. Just give us an idea of what you're going to see in a surreal film, because I've seen a few.
Okay, so what's interesting about that film, because Dali had a part.
What's the name of it?
Chien Andalou.
Okay.
So, which means the dog something. I don't remember exactly, but. So Chien Andalou, again, Dali had a part in actually making that film. And, so the thing is that filmmakers and film critics have critiqued those films. But if you go back and ask the actual filmmaker, like Bunuel or Dali, they say, my only intent was to make something irrational. So the idea is that surrealism derives from the unconscious. So when you're sitting there and suddenly something comes to you, whether it be through a dream or an idea that just comes from nowhere, they would put that into an art form, and that's basically what they did. So Chien Andalou's about, I think it's like a 25-minute movie, and it's got imagery in it of, like, for example, there's one shot of a hand, and there's a hole in the hand with ants coming out. And you see ants recurring in Salvador Dali's work. So that was, according to him, a dream that he had, and then he just took his idea from the dream and put it into his art in various ways, from painting.
Now, this was actually related to the fact that the irrational films were tapping into the unconscious. This is related to the very real science of Freud and Jung at the time, wasn't it?
Exactly.
So it was showing an interest. It was sort of interpreting science.
Right.
Somewhat.
Yeah, absolutely. And the interpretation of dreams, which was Freud's most notorious work, arguably.
Notorious?
Yeah, notorious.
Okay, but go ahead.
What did I say?
No, that's
okay.
notorious.
Yeah, notorious. So he, that work, that writing, that piece of writing in particular, inspired all of the surrealistic filmmakers and artists as well. So let me take a step back as well. The founder of surrealism was actually André Breton, and
where's he from?
Paris as well.
Okay.
So he's a Frenchman, and so he wrote the Surrealistic Manifesto. So in writing the Surrealistic Manifesto, he set about, I guess, guidelines for the artist to follow or not to follow, which happens in a lot of artistic movements.
Was he part of that manifesto group that actually published a manifesto? About the fast cars, or is that a different? That's a different group.
That might be different, yeah.
Okay. But did he actually publish a manifesto?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
okay.
And you can find it online, even to this day. If you go on, there's quotes from it online. And actually, I have a quote from it. If you want me to read one real quick.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So this was from André Breton in the Surrealistic Manifesto. I could spend my whole life prying loose the secrets of the insane. The people are honest to a fault, and their naivety has no peer but my own.
future shows, we'll be exploring the many facets of the science fiction subculture here in the Denver area, happenings, literature, authors, more film topics, media, conventions, and interesting things to do for science people. We already have a few lined up here to talk to you.
So,
So they don't have hidden agendas like the rest of us.
exactly, yeah.
Okay.
And basically, I think that statement says that the insane a lot of times work from the unconscious, I would say. And I would think that a psychologist would contend that as well. So, in the same way that dreams are irrational, all of life is irrational if you think about it long and hard. So really they're tapping into the unconscious, which might not make linear sense in terms of how we typically think, but it makes sense in terms of the way that the world functions.
Or how our brains process it and filter it.
Exactly.
I suppose.
Right. Exactly. So, so Bunuel had stages in his career where he made things that were purely surreal, where you can't really make sense of a storyline. But then he had some moments as well where he made some more traditional pieces, in particular when he was in Mexico. And even though those still have surrealistic elements to them, they were more along the traditional lines, probably because he was getting his career back on track. But once he was back in Paris, I think he had pure and utter artistic freedom to make what he wanted. And his films started to become more and more irrational, like they had started off as.
Can you give a couple of titles of some of the other movies? Because I know I've seen several of his films.
Yeah, so
The ones later in life were really nice, color, color film and everything.
So a couple of his early movies, the first most important one was Chien Andalou, and let me mention too, I forgot to mention this earlier, and Chien Andalou, when that film was released in Paris, it was said that it provoked riots because of the blasphemous nature of it and the political nature of it.
And that was the one that was grotesque also. Is that the one you
Exactly,
described?
yeah,
Okay.
where the eyeball is sliced. And it's actually a cow's eye, so they went out and they got a cow's eyeball. And there's a close-up on it, and you can actually see, if you look closely, the hair of the cow on the eyelid. But it's an extreme close-up, so you mostly just see the eyeball. But when you first watch it, you just think it's a regular eyeball. And it's peering at the moon, and then suddenly it's slit by a razor blade.
Yeah, that's pretty grotesque.
So to say like the juxtaposition of shots laying side by side is important too, because when you're peering at the moon and then suddenly your eyeball is sliced, that has implications, if you think long and hard about it, that might have different meaning to one person and different meaning to another. But again, if you ask somebody like Bunuel what that means, he would say, I had a dream about that. And that's basically all he would say. Same with Dali. So his early films were Chien Andalou, L'Âge d'Or, which is the translation is the Age of Gold. And that film was a little bit longer. Dali is credited on that, but I don't think he had much to do with it. There's a burning giraffe in that film, which is something that Dali puts in a lot of his paintings. So that's interesting if you're a Dali fan. And he also made a documentary called Land Without Bread, where they shot a goat off the mountainside, which again goes back to the grotesque nature of
Okay, now
what they were
nowadays
doing.
that really
So-
wouldn't be tolerated for animal cruelty, right? I mean,
Right,
did they shoot a
right.
real goat off probably?
Yeah, and I actually heard that Bunuel had the gun, and the cameraman was shooting, and he said, "Give me the gun," and he shot the goat off the mountainside, and it came falling down. So again,
I mean, back then probably that was not considered horrific to do something like
Right,
that.
well,
Where today you'd have that's offensive.
well, no, I mean, but again, these films I think were extremely offensive even in those days. Again, hence the reason why they provoked riots when they were
Okay.
released. So,
Okay.
again, so those were his early pictures that he made in Paris before leaving because of the war. So, Chien Andalou, L'Âge d'Or, and Land Without Bread, and those are all shorts. So
Okay, now those all have political messages of some. They all have the three elements you mentioned.
yeah, absolutely. And politically, typically what they were attacking, in particular Bunuel, was he was attacking the middle class, the upper middle class, which he calls the bourgeoisie. And
Why?
one of his late, I think it's because of the way that he was raised. So he was raised, I think, more in the lower class areas of Spain.
Where they probably went hungry for real.
Exactly,
Spain,
right.
yeah.
And that's a theme in Land Without Bread is really, really poor people that are starving. So he was constantly making fun of the rich and the upper middle class in his movies. And he made a movie in the 70s when he was back in Paris called The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie. And it's an extremely surreal picture, but again, he's going about making fun of the upper middle class, which some people find offensive, I suppose.
But that's interesting because even today, where people think there's class wars going on, even in this country,
Right.
if he was around, they'd be a target.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I mean, driving, blatantly large gas guzzling cars, living in McMansions, things that are considered kind of vulgar, actually, by a lot of people's standards.
I see that Lazarus has buzzed in, and on the screen, he notes that he has a comment for our guest. So let's see what Lazarus has to say.
When I want to imitate surrealism, I go into random mode. There is no way for me to emulate creativity like humans do since I have no DNA and wired memories. Fascinating topics, Mr. Forrester.
Absolutely, yeah. And one of the major motifs in his films is people eating at dinner tables, having really ritzy, expensive dinners. And The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie opens up with a group of upper middle class people eating a really fancy dinner in a restaurant, and they find out that there's a dead man in a coffin in the other room. So
there's actually a little bit.
Attention listeners. Please go to the nearest emergency door and exit the spacecraft. What? Oh. Sorry, wrong message. Attention listeners. Please go to the next track, part 2 of Surreal Cinema. This ends part 1. Welcome back listeners. This is part 2 of Surreal Cinema with filmmaker Will Forrester. I'll be off.
Bit of a story to that.
Absolutely,
one. Okay.
yeah. And
but it makes a point.
Right.
So then what happens?
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah. And it goes on. And then in The Phantom of Liberty, back to the dinner table motif, he has one of the rich people sitting on toilets instead of on chairs. So he's making.
I've seen that film.
Yeah,
yes.
he's making blatant cuts at, the upper middle class, and then. That film also, the Phantom of Liberty, starts off with a guy eating the Eucharist in a church, a madman going through screaming and eating the Eucharist, shoveling it down his mouth. So, again, he's making a statement on religion right there. And you go back to...
Like what? What do you think?
Well,
you were raised a Catholic,
yeah,
so I mean,
and so was he, and he was highly against the Catholic Church.
That they were wealthy, or well, I'm leading you, and I don't mean to. What do you think?
It's. I think again, it comes with his upbringing and maybe having Catholicism shoved down his throat
in a poor country where they were starving during fascist times in Spain.
Exactly, and then you have the Church, who has always had a lot of money and still does to this day, and lives extravagantly, especially the upper tiers of the church.
Sure. Okay.
So, but so the films that and so my favorite film I think of Bunuel is called Viridiana, and that was one of his Mexico pictures. And that film involves a nun who decides to bring a bunch of homeless people back to a mansion to help them, and they actually end up turning on her, even though she's being a good Samaritan by bringing the homeless people in. But it's an extremely dark picture, and that film in particular has a more linear approach to it in terms of the story. You can make absolute sense of the story, but it has surrealistic elements and motifs of Bunuel that are unmistakable, like the church, and again, he goes back to the motif of dinner parties and so on and so forth. So
Well, budget-wise, dinner parties, as a filmmaker, dinner parties are, inexpensive to film, right? They're in one location.
Right.
Everybody can talk.
Yeah.
You can see everyone. They're not walking around.
Yeah.
You don't have to change the focus.
right,
Yeah.
food
so-
doesn't necessarily have to be real.
Yeah. And he's probably had a nice budget to make those movies.
Yeah,
as
well,
well.
again, in that era, I think he was kind of getting his feet back on the ground because he'd been, thrown into the ground by having to leave for the war, and then all the stuff that Dolly.
Well, and then
had
being
said about
accused
him.
of being a communist back in the 50s was
Right.
like being accused of being a terrorist
Right.
today.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you can go. I mean, Chaplin had to leave this country for that reason. You can go on down the list. There was the Hollywood 10 that was blacklisted, mostly writers. And
What was the deal with writers and artists? Because they were stepping out of line, or like today when artists and writers step out of line?
Well, I guess.
It's actually more freedom today.
Yeah, but ultimately, one of the main reasons it was happening, so if you look at the Hollywood 10, they were blacklisted primarily because there's a huge Jewish influence in Hollywood at that time.
Oh, okay.
So the majority of the producers in Hollywood were Jewish, and if there was any hint of anti-Semitism, then that was it. So looking at it from that point of view, because the war obviously made everybody so emotional, including Hollywood producers. Mm-hmm. If you look at it from that standpoint,
a lot of people murdered by Nazis.
Right, exactly, which was, they were considered the communists of that time.
Okay.
So that was part of the reason for, I think, the high emotions at that point in time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But, at the same time today, it is comparable to, I think, what's going on in the Middle East and how 9/11 happened. And so, people, if they're called a terrorist just because they're Islamic, they're suddenly not allowed to come back to the country, like Cat Stevens.
Oh, yeah, poor old Cat Stevens, yeah.
There's no doubt that, it's like... it's
and then the random terror alerts that they have, some are real and some are just schmucks. I don't know, emailing the wrong person.
Right. Yeah, and we're all really affected by it because you can't fly today.
You can't fly.
Without noticing the implications of it.
Yeah, interesting. All right, we're going to take a break and go have a chat with Lazarus and see what's going on in Denver tonight.
Alrighty.
Extremely dangerous conditions tonight. It's very wintry, cold, and that storm front is kicking up like Charles Dickens in a debtor's prison. It's snowing up here. I am heading in. No more flying tonight. Stay warm, dear listeners.
Hey, hello listeners, we're back with filmmaker Will Forrester, and he's telling us all about cinematic surrealism. So, we've got a little bit of a historical flavor of what it's all about, and you mentioned a lot of it has to do with the unconscious mind. That's what the artist and filmmaker is attempting to connect to. And but let's talk about some maybe some of the filmmakers that our current audience might recognize some of their names. I saw on your list you had Cocteau, and he's not that common, but I've seen some of his films, like that old Beauty and the Beast was really beautifully filmed and weird. And let's talk about some modern filmmakers. So take the floor, Will. And
okay, well, some of the better-known filmmakers that are making surrealistic pictures today, I would say Darren Aronofsky, who made Requiem for a Dream, Pi, and The Fountain, right? So those all have surrealistic elements. Pi was, if I remember correctly, somewhat irrational in terms of the storyline, and it's definitely, it borders along the line of sci-fi / surrealism. There's no doubt about it. So you can see the parallels between the two. And same with The Fountain. It's a sci-fi movie as well. But the most notable filmmaker, I would say, who makes surrealistic pictures, and I don't think people realize that they're surrealistic, is David Lynch. And he's actually really well liked in France. He probably has a bigger fan base in France than he does here.
Really? Because he's very popular here, and he's even consistent with a lot of the films that he makes with the with the color, the really intense color and.
Yeah. See, I've always felt that he has more of a cult following in the U.S. And less of a mainstream appeal.
Oh, it's probably true.
And
true.
I think, France is a little more progressive in their filmmaking. They always have been. And
speaking of which, in a future show, we are going to cover the French New Wave filmmakers as well.
All right, good. Yeah,
and of course, Will's expertise is on the horror genre too. And those definitely blend into science fiction movies most of the time. But okay, back to David Lynch though.
So, this day and age, I've read a couple books about David Lynch, and he does Buddhist meditation. So he meditates, and he's actually mentioned that that's where he gets most of his film ideas this day and age, is from meditating. And when you're meditating, you're tapping the unconscious. That's basically what you're doing. So it is surrealism, it's surrealism to the fullest extent. So the film Inland Empire is probably his most surrealistic picture. And he's always had elements of it. His first film, Eraserhead, it's got some surrealistic qualities as well. But I feel like he's becoming more and more irrational as he gets older, which is a good thing.
And now we'll take a break. A word from our sponsors. Jettas Performance, specializing in turbocharger systems. You'll find a wide range of parts and systems for Hyundai, Kia, and Infiniti, and many universal applications. Jettas Performance. New products include equal-length turbo manifold, downpipe with wastegate, anodized dual fuel rail kit, and a complete fuel controller. If you have any ideas for your vehicle to improve performance, contact the Techie Geniuses at www.jettas.com.
Oh yeah. A lot of filmmakers, as they get older, I guess they feel freer to do what they want and probably have the resources to do it as well.
Yeah, exactly. He's even, to mention, he just produced a movie that was directed by Werner Herzog.
David Lynch did?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
David Lynch produced it, called My Son, What Have Ye Done? And that's a good example. It was released in 2010, I believe. And
I did not see that. Did you see that movie?
Yeah, I did.
Okay.
It's really good. But that's a great example, I think, of a surrealistic picture that has somewhat of a linear storyline, so your average viewer can follow it and be content.
Did Werner? What are some other films that Werner has done?
So his most famous films were Fitzcarraldo, and from the 70s, and also Aguirre, The Wrath of God.
Okay.
So he did those again back in the late 70s, and then he's made over 50 feature films.
Yeah, he's done a lot of. I've seen some of his movies. He even did a Vietnam movie, I think, a couple years ago.
Yeah, it was
with POWs.
Exactly.
Escaping.
Yeah, which was based on a documentary that he made.
Yes, a true
called
story.
Little Theater Needs to Fly.
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, but he's all over the board, and
talk a little bit about Inland Empire, because if people have seen that and they didn't understand what was going on, that would be the point.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And again, so if you think, because
that's how our brains work, that's how our minds work.
Yeah. So if you think about it in terms of David Lynch sitting in the Buddhist pose meditating, which is kind of an interesting image. He's just taking ideas, and he actually said that he didn't feel like his imagination truly expanded until he started to meditate, which is worth noting, because think about how bizarre some of his early movies were. Mm-hmm. And if he doesn't feel like his mind opened up until he really started to tap the unconscious, then I just think that's worth noting. But so Inland Empire, it's a 3-hour movie that didn't really do well in theaters. In fact, I don't think it was released in most major cities in the U.S. It was released in L.A. and New York, and it might have been in a city like Denver for only a short period of time.
Yeah, I saw it.
In the theater?
Here.
Yeah.
Yes, I saw it.
I don't think it was in the theater for very long because it wasn't making any money.
Well, it's weird to American audiences, a movie like that, because it wasn't, the story jumped around a little bit as if you were, as your thoughts do.
Right. And the advantage of that from a filmmaker's point of view is that you can do more things technically if you're not as worried about the story. So technically those films are really interesting with the sound, the way that they use sound and the way that they're edited and shot.
And the color, because that's something I notice about a David Lynch film, is the color is really heightened, and he puts thought into either that or he saw it in a dream, maybe.
Right.
That the color is amazing in his movies.
Yeah. I mean, in that movie, and even in Mulholland Drive, I think I remember reading somewhere that he's almost going for the old Technicolor look. So the colors are extremely saturated.
Yes.
And he started shooting things on video because he thinks that some old video cameras have that Technicolor look to them. Not a brand new HD camera. I mean, he likes old school video cameras that have a certain visual quality.
So he's
to them.
sort of doing experimental film work as well. Then, if he's playing around with the equipment, not just making a movie.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely.
As like an artist. I mean, that's what an artist does.
Exactly. Yeah. So, in terms of what you can do technically, I mean, your spectrum is much broader because I mean, if you have a script that's been read over and over and rewritten by Hollywood producers and they want a certain story to go a certain way, your technical abilities are limited instantly. To whereas if you're making films where the idea behind them is that they're irrational and that you're doing it more as an art form, from the standpoint of using film as an art medium versus as a storytelling medium.
Now, Will, you've made a couple of films. I'm not sure I'd call them irrational, but they were definitely experimental films that have been shown around Denver. And I think you've even sold some of them, and they've been in quite a few film festivals. And they were film as an art form. Can you talk about a couple of those? Because they were more themed, not story necessarily.
Yeah, so I made a film called Elegant Disposition. That was probably, when was that, like 2005, I think. And that film was actually picked up by a distributor, so I've had the most success with that. But again, so some of the major themes and motifs in that were all based on the technicalities of filmmaking. So I was concerned about how the camera moves and also getting an image that has somewhat of an abstract quality. So when you're watching it, it's almost like watching, I suppose it's the idea of watching something that might be depicting the unconscious.
And it was organic and fluid, and there were some images in there you could almost, I mean, we tried to do that, I suppose, as an awake viewer, as a conscious viewer.
Right.
That you could kind of pick out some images, but it was rotoscoped.
Right, it was rotoscoped, yeah. And, so, I mean, one of my biggest inspirations is Stan Brakhage, and he made purely abstract films that were silent, and he made over 400 films in his lifetime. So his idea was
probably on real film as well.
Oh,
which
yeah,
is very
he
difficult
was
to
a
work
diehard
with.
Filmmaker.
Yeah. Compared to video.
Yeah, but so his whole idea behind it was to make films in the same manner that a painter would make paintings. So it's not rare for a painter like Vincent van Gogh to have 400 paintings in a lifetime. And he wanted to do the same thing where he's using it more as an artistic medium because somehow along the lines in the history of film it turned into a storytelling medium. But if you use it as an artistic medium and really, really play around with the different elements of film, which would go along the lines of light, time, and movement, similar to the elements of art, which would be texture, shape, form, value, so on and so forth, you can actually advance the medium to a much higher level than if you're just using it to tell a story with actors. So it's almost like it's suspending its artistic merit by not going into it a little bit further and using the elements of film to their fullest extent.
So some of these modern people that you mentioned, Aronofsky and David Lynch, who was the other one that you mentioned?
Let's see, there's Aronofsky, Lynch, those are the two most notorious, I'd say, in the U.S.
Okay.
Herzog made one picture recently, but I wouldn't consider him a surrealistic filmmaker in general. He just kind of dabbled in the genre for a couple of films. So.
Because a couple of the films that you mentioned were unique in those ways, that traditional Hollywood filmmaker would not do.
Right. Well, even The Fountain, I think about half that script has dialogue and the other half is purely visual.
Beautifully visual,
Right.
also.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I saw that one in the theater too. I mean, it's fun to watch them on your big LCD flat screen, and they look pretty good.
Right.
But it's still not the same as seeing them in a theater, seeing a film like that
Yeah,
on a
absolutely.
big screen.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now you had mentioned a couple others, early times and recent, and then there was a couple in between. So there's been surreal filmmakers along the way, really,
Yeah. Right.
throughout the history of film. Who are some of those people?
Well, going back, I guess, if you go back into the 60s, you've got people like Fellini. Hitchcock had elements of surrealism in his movies. And in fact, he made a movie, I think in the late 40s, called Spellbound with Gregory Peck. And Salvador Dali was the art director for a dream sequence in that.
Oh, really?
And it looks just like a Salvador Dali painting. It's really, really worth watching. So Hitchcock kind of dabbled in surrealism as well, in the way that his films are shot and with his experimental music by Bernard Herrmann. There's definitely surrealistic elements in those. So there was Hitchcock, Fellini, let's see.
Cocteau was one that I
Yeah,
had
Cocteau.
seen in
Yeah,
videos.
Cocteau, absolutely. Jan Spankmeyer, who's from Northern Europe, I believe. He does horror/surrealistic pictures, and he actually has claymations intercut with live action sequences. So yeah, he's definitely a very unique filmmaker. Nobody makes films like Jan Spankmeyer. And also Alejandro Jodorowsky, who has inspired people like Marilyn Manson and some of the darker artists of our day. But his films are absurdly blasphemous. And one of the
Give an
last,
example, yeah. Okay.
So one of the last movies I watched of him had Jesus walking around, and then Jesus made a doll of himself, and he was walking around with the doll of himself, and people were making fun of him, and but I mean, it was, and there were some really, really grotesque shots in that too. That was almost unbearable. It almost seemed like it was shock value type stuff. But again, it's meant to be irrational, and I would even argue offensive. There's no doubt about that. That's the intent with some of those movies. So.
Okay, one other topic that we had sort of, you and I had discussed was, and you briefly mentioned it, that Americans aren't as accustomed to seeing abstract art and film. Is that true? As Europeans, especially French or German?
Yeah,
because there's that German guy, Chickvar, makes some pretty bizarre movies too. They're not exactly irrational, but...
Right. Yeah, I mean, I would say...
Is that true? Or?
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, I suppose if you look at the history of film in each country, say you just take France and the United States, and you look at the history of films, I mean, French films have always been a little more experimental. You take some of the old filmmakers like Bresson, and he's got such a distinct style, and you look at some of the Hollywood filmmakers like Howard Hawks, and you go into some of those old filmmakers, and a lot of those pictures look the same because of the studio system. So even though there was a studio system in France and Italy, and there's, I think it was much more prominent here, and there was less artistic leeway. It's more of a business, I would argue, in the United States, and it's a business there as well. There's no doubt about that. But I just feel like there's more of an appreciation for the aesthetics of the film over there than there is here, and it's primarily because of the overall system in each country
and the culture, probably.
Yeah, definitely,
well.
because films are made. Most films are made to make money. So the culture accepts filmmakers like Bresson, who is making really slow pictures and with close-ups and a lack of music and that kind of thing. And the French viewers would go back and watch those and buy tickets for those. Whereas if you show a Bresson film here, when he was making those pictures in the 30s and 40s, people wouldn't have watched them, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So, but they wanted to see Marilyn Monroe singing about diamonds and that kind of thing,
Mm-hmm.
which is unfortunate.
I like diamonds.
All right, the interview's over.
I'm kidding. Diamonds are a girl's best friend. Don't you know that?
Right.
My mother told me that when I was little. Okay, Will, tell us a little bit again before we go here about your project here that you're working on.
Okay, so again, I'm working on a feature animation called Blood Trail, and it's a hand-drawn animation. I'm doing most of the work by myself. Hopefully,
Who's
things go
scoring the
smoothly.
music for you?
I'm actually writing the music for the
Oh,
picture
nice.
myself, which
Nice.
I'm
Look
excited
forward
about.
to that.
Yeah, so I think there's a big correlation between the art of cinema and the art of music, so I really enjoy doing both.
Well, Will, it's been fun talking about the unconscious mind and how some artists have been, and filmmakers have been able to take it and run with it. So,
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
yeah, thanks.
Spiro Pictures is a science fiction content provider for the science fiction community.
Thanks for joining us. Thanks, Lazarus, for the local updates, and we'll chat again next week. Have a great week.